I grew up listening to Rush Limbaugh and learning about conservative politics through the lens of his wit and thoughts about government. He was funny and had a great way of making the inside baseball lingo of government make sense to millions of people. I learned through my own confirmation bias how to operate within the two-party world, and generally speaking, that led me to the Republican ticket for all of my adult life. I saw them as the party most interested in capitalism and good government. I remember coming to awareness that the discussions Rush had with us each day were often tempered by the pull of the party when Ron Paul ran in 2008. I loved Dr. Paul. He was like fresh air in a very stagnant time. Rush dismissed him, and it was complicated for me. Mr. Paul was talking about genuine liberty ideals, ones that I thought I had heard Rush talk about for years. I remember tuning in after the first debate and thinking, Rush has to like this guy, only to be vividly disappointed by him saying every one of the people on the stage, except for the tinfoil hat guy, would be better than the Democratic nominee. It was disappointing, to say the least, and was the first time in my life that I realized my convictions around the principles were unfortunately the victims of the duopoly system. I still listened to Rush as the years went by because I thought he was funny and an excellent communicator, but I was tempered in my translation of his discussions to my actual engagement in politics. I remember thinking, as sincerely as I could, that I was going to engage in politics from a critical thinking position and never give any one person or party the power over my own thinking and understanding of natural law. In 2016, I was a proponent of Dr. Paul's son, Rand. I went to a rally in Colorado and bought my first political merchandise. I was an advocate for him and thought of all the people running that year, he was by far the most principled of the batch, particularly as contrasted against Donald Trump. I appreciated Mr. Trump in 2016. He was brash, painfully harsh in his apparent honesty about the system, and had a political muscle that had not been seen in Republicans in my lifetime. He could judo wrestle any of his opponents to the mat and dispatched easily the competition, including Rand Paul. I voted for him, with many reservations, but watched gleefully on election night as the media melted down and Trump won states that hadn't been in the Republican column since Ronald Reagan. It was clearly shocking to most, but I remember telling friends and neighbors that I thought he was going to win based upon the terrible campaign that Hillary ran, and frankly, what an unlikable and arrogant person she was. Her condescension of the average American was as thick as movie popcorn butter, and her campaign just as greasy. But as Trump began to govern, he never really demonstrated any real conservative values as I had understood them from my years listening to Rush. He said he wanted to deal with D.C. in a way that would have lined his pedigree as a conservative, but it never happened. He used executive orders, a very unrepublic-oriented device to implement his policies. Most of us understood he was up against very strong headwinds, but his choices in cabinet, advisors, and actual thoughts on definitive political issues seemed to be either ignorant at best or antithetical to the platform at worst. His promises on the border, spending, swamp draining, China, and other things all fell flat. He was good about U.S. intervention and European politics, but the rest seemed to leave a republic-minded person wanting. I see the individual as the highest priority in any government, and then any kind of cooperation something that should be voluntary and in the best interest of the nation. Trump's actions along the way seemed very much like every other politician that had come along. There was a heavy reliance upon the state to solve the problems, with platitudes and lip service given to the rights of the individual. The instinct he had, however, was never at compromise, but instead at schoolyard antics designed to show the foolishness of liberal thinking. The objective seemed more in alignment with mocking and call-outs than it did to functioning good republicanism. The wheels came off the bus for me in 2020. His surrendering of the government to bureaucrats and advisors has left America in the shambles we find it in today. The inflation we see has not been helped by an inept puppet president, but the actual damage was done under the Trump presidency. He was the one that, with his inclinations to shut the country down, started the whole domino of destruction. Nearly everything we dislike today in the country can be pointed to that moment in 2020 as the beginning of our current misery. Inflation, immigration, election integrity, housing prices, government overreach in our speech and thought. They may not have started with Mr. Trump, but the smaller brush fire that was there had gasoline poured upon it, and the wildfire rages out of control because of it. Make no mistake, Washington has been a mess for as long as I've been alive. They believe too much in their own capabilities and too little in the American people. They see us as children and govern as such. Nothing demonstrated that more than COVID. We were the immature, irresponsible, spoiled children that couldn't handle ourselves. We can never be told the truth because we are incapable of understanding complex geopolitical issues or the inner workings of the alphabet agencies. Yet that is exactly the opposite of what we actually need as a society. Trust is built on truth, and we have a lot of truth to tell to reclaim any semblance of a trusted institution. If we lived in a utopia, I would prefer that what we have would all be burnt down at this point, given its cancerous invasion of the body politic. But I also live in reality and loathe violence. Revolutions are usually filled with violence and more damning outcomes than those that are derived by reason and rationale. That is the hope I hold as we move towards this year. I don't want to play the same old games of picking candidates based upon their party. And while I've not been inclined to that in the past and have tried to vote based upon principle, this year the merry-go-round stops. I want a significant realignment, one probably more in line with the rhetoric about the swamp and elevation of the individual that most have thought they might be getting with politicians like Trump, but didn't get. The world changed after COVID. The government showed their hand and their objectives and did everything they could to make sure that the plebes were ruled over. Old labels like Democrats and Republicans and liberals and conservatives have been replaced with authoritarians and liberty-minded people. There are only two ways through this: more brutality and force, or relentless pursuit of the rights of the individual. If anyone speaks to this in their pursuit of office or power, those are the voices to align with. It won't come this time in the traditional formats. It won't come from fighting about the normal, luxuriously laden conversations that come from a stable and affluent society. We are in the trenches now, discussing serious things that will ultimately have devastating consequences if we get it wrong. The truth will be stinging. The files on JFK, Vietnam, Watergate, Desert Storm, 9/11, weapons of mass destruction, COVID, and the bioweapons we are making are going to be staggering and lead people to an intense discussion about the role and place of government. It's time, and it's necessary. And while this might have an air of picking on Trump, we as conservative-minded people should take hard assessment of our participation in the failures we've been privy to. We were led astray on weapons of mass destruction, the Vietnam War, the FBI, and police state nobility, John McCain, Mitt Romney, George W., the Patriot Act, the TikTok ban, social medias are private companies, and on and on. We stand here, acting as if it was the dastardly Democrats who did this to us. We picked these people and policies. We have no one to blame but ourselves for the role we played as the Washington Generals, willing over and over to give up the high value of the individual, not for the betterment of the country, but for self-service at the expense of the country. For all our claims at skepticism of big government, we played the fool and brought along the biggest government in the history of man. If this is ever going to change, we need honesty in government and in ourselves in order to realign towards the liberty outcome we all know is best for our country in the future.